Okay, so this video will very quickly go over a philosopher giving a lecture at the Orrery and Monticello. In the process, I'll also talk a bit about what the Enlightenment is and was about, what neoclassical style is about, and Rococo. I'm not going to go over every single slide here because the slideshow will be available to you. There's no need for me to repeat what you can read. So I'm just going to point out some highlights of things that you need to pay attention to. First of all, we're going to talk about the Enlightenment. I've already mentioned the Enlightenment with respect to the Spaniard and Indian producer mestizo and the Enlightenment's interest in science and mathematics and categorization. And the Enlightenment isn't really a style so much as a mindset, a set of interests and kind of trajectory for thinking. So it's not really so much a style. What we see often in artwork that is Enlightenment artwork is generally are often Baroque style or Neoclassical style, which I'll get into in just a moment. But this is definitely leaning towards the Baroque. But again, ultimately, when you think about the Enlightenment, you're going to think about lighting things up, emphasis on reason, on mathematics, on science, right? On trying to understand things logically and reasonably, and that these things can solve the problems of the world. So there is a sense of kind of utopian possibility that the world can be fixed through through science and reason. I could go off about why that's a big problem, but I don't have time. So our main work that we want to think about when it comes to the Enlightenment is going to be a philosopher giving a lecture at the Orrery, but of course, so we want to keep in mind that the Spaniard and Indian producer mestizo as well. You can read this yourself. Of course, the thing I'm going to really note here is not just the lighting, obviously, which is super dramatic, but the construction, the composition of the piece, where people are placed, the fact that we only get this person's back, and we've got a space here almost for the so we could step into it. So I would study this very carefully. Look what you see here. This guy is obviously the man in charge. Look at all that red, look at that power, and look at these children gazing on in the wonder of scientific discovery. So I've already mentioned that. Joseph Wright of Derby is known for these paintings that have this dramatic tenebrism and also involve usually scientific experiments. So here's another one, experiment with a bird and an air pump. The lighting may remind you somewhat of Rachel Ruysch's, who is also an Enlightenment style thinker, but with Baroque Enlightenment style artist, but with Baroque style. Enlightenment thinking artist, but with Baroque style. So that should remind you of that. So you can read this yourself. I'm not going to read it. You should definitely read it though. So this presentation is available to you here, so you should definitely read it. You need to know what an orrery is. I tell you what that is. Make sure you absolutely know what it is and what it does. Let's see here. So again, I want to emphasize the light pouring on, especially the faces of the children, because the children are our future, yes? And they are the hope, right? And we want to suggest that, light, the idea of light often is correlated with kind of epiphanic moments, religious exaltation or religious awakenings. So that should remind you, of course, of this piece. Yes, the Calling of St. Matthew. Baroque. Yeah. Also tenebrism. All right. There is a Khan Academy video on this work you absolutely need to watch. All right. I'm moving on very quickly. Again, this is just a very quickly overview highlights. All right. Neoclassical style. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 works specifically we need to think about when we think about neoclassical style. Here they are. Neoclassical, turning back to the Romans and the Greeks. Now, first of all, you might think but didn't they just do that in the Renaissance? Yes, they did. But when was the Renaissance? The Renaissance was in the 15th and the 16th centuries, right? So the 1400s and 1500s. Look where we are in time. We're in the mid 18th century, right? So we're in the 1700s, late 1700s, and sometimes even it's in the 19th century. So yes, time, hundreds of years have passed. So yes, there's coming back to the Romans and Greeks at this point. So with coming back to the Romans and Greeks and what they're interested in, there's emphasis on orderly compositions. There also happens to be, with Neoclassicism, a desire for brushwork that you can't even see. You can't really even see the brush strokes. It's done so smoothly. And as I've already mentioned, it's often closely aligned with Enlightenment thought. I'll talk about romantic content, or what romanticism is at this time, a little bit later. It can have various meanings, but okay, Monticello. Monticello, you probably know the home of Thomas Jefferson. I'm not going to go over this. You need to read this presentation yourself. There's also a Khan Academy article that I highly recommend that you read. So when we look at this, we can absolutely see the Roman and Greek influence. But if you know anything about Thomas Jefferson, you also know there is a strong tie to France. That's because Neoclassicism is really big in France. I'll talk more about that in a moment. The name Monticello means little mountain. Why is this called Little Mountain? Well, if you see it in context, here it is. We're in the rolling hills of Virginia, kind of obviously on a crest of a hill. So the layout, very orderly, should absolutely remind you of those really well-ordered Roman and Greek pieces. You want to think about the materials for Monticello, right? Normally on a building like this, what are you going to think about? You're going to think about marble and really expensive materials, but instead he uses local wood and brick. Right. So that's the fact that he's using local wood and brick is an expression of something. It's an expression of him being a quote unquote common man. Whereas, of course, the Romans and the Greeks generally tried to elevate themselves, especially the Romans. Jefferson is asserting the idea of being one with the people, right? And that's expressed through the materials there. You can read that yourself, and you should. We have a domed room, in the center, of course. You always when you look at a dome, you always want to think about the history of domes and all the other domes that you've looked at. I have here the dome adds verticality to the building, but overall the building is overwhelmingly horizontal. So you want to think about that. What's the suggestion about horizontality, right? So what does it mean? It means that you're close to the ground, right? You're kind of not one with the earth, but you're more in a reachable realm, as opposed to going high up into verticality. Right. So the emphasis on the horizontality, again, emphasizes that kind of common man, regular man. I don't mean peasantry, but I mean common man in the elevated sense of common man, not in the sense that we're not trying to set up a hierarchical system in this country. Ideally, I don't know if it really works out that way, but that's the idea behind this. It's a great idea. Okay, so there's great symmetricality, as I already mentioned. The porch is Doric. You want to think about, well, why Doric columns? Well, Doric is the least extravagant column. It's the most plain, most straightforward, right? You want to think about those ideals. All right. Definitely read this page. I'm not going to go over it. The connection to Republican Roman ideals of civic and moral virtues. We got to get that connected to what's going on with the establishment of the United States, especially with neoclassical architecture. Jefferson believed that art was a social tool, could be a social tool. He wanted an art style. He wanted to use an art style that looked distinctly American, not Baroque style, which was still really popular in Europe. because it looked too fancy and extravagant. And we're Americans and we don't want that, right? So that's Baroque, too much, right? You know Monticello from the nickel. This is an example of something that's built around the same time, which is St. Paul's Cathedral by Christopher Wren. Which is rather extravagant in comparison to what we see with neoclassical buildings. Again, neoclassicism is really big in France. By adopting more neoclassical style rather than Baroque style, we're reinforcing our ties to France, which of course Jefferson's going to want to do, not reinforce ties to Britain. All right, so you should definitely read this. It's really important. You can read it yourself. All right, definitely know this. Definitely know this. Okay. Yeah, there's just some sites. There is a virtual tour. You can look at that or not. Okay, finally, Rococo. We already looked at the Rococo piece, which is the Marigella mode, but it's a little bit different in that Rococo Marigella mode, the tete-a-tete for Marigella mode is Rococo in style, not so much content. When we talk about Rococo, it's very frothy and frilly and light and airy and exuberant. And of course, that appeals, of course, to the upper class, just like we talked about Baroque style tended to appeal to royalty and nobility because it kind of confirmed their right to rule. Rococo does even more so. Rococo is like Baroque on steroids. We'll look at the swing. This is we'll look at these Elizabeth Lebrun's self-portrait as well. But these are the three pieces that are Rococo in style. But again, when you think Rococo, think Baroque on steroids. All right. That was very quick. Again, the presentation itself is on is here. You need to go through the presentation yourself and take better notes. Thank you.